125 Black suspects were tortured while in police custody and chronicles the history of torture in Chicago, the burgeoning activist movement against police violence, and the American public's complicity in perpetuating torture at home and abroad. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Laurence Ralph.
Sorry. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. The excerpt that I'll read today is from part 1 of my book, and it's entitled An Open Letter to the Future Mayor of Chicago. I'm a researcher who's writing a book on the history of police torture in your city. The more I learn about this history, the more I feel the need to write you, even though I cannot be certain who exactly you will be. If history is any guide, you and all the other future mayors of Chicago are likely to be a well-connected politician who has a cozy relationship with exactly the instruments of government that I'm suggesting are most in need of change. But I must write you anyway because I believe that change is always possible, however unlikely it may seem in the present. You likely have been briefed about police torture. Perhaps you have gotten reassurances from the superintendent of the police department. You might have even met with survivors of police torture. But what I've found in studying this issue for more than a decade is that its complexities are endless, and thus a strict historical approach or a policy-oriented approach doesn't actually clarify the full extent of the problem. To do that, we need not only facts, but a metaphor. The first thing you must know is that the torture tree is firmly planted in your city. Its roots are deep, its trunk sturdy, its branches spread wide, its leaves cast dark shadows. Indeed, the torture tree is rooted in an enduring idea of threat that is foundational to life in the United States. The very idea of safety in the United States is rooted in the frontier logic that justified the settlement of this country in the 18th century. For the white settlers, safety was premised on viewing Native Americans as threats, and so transforming them into savages. This frontier logic is still prevalent today. It is foundational, in fact, to modern day policing. We can see it at work when one court after another acquits cops who gunned down African Americans under the pretext that those cops felt threatened. In such cases, the violence enacted against Black people works to turn the police officers who actually committed the violence into the victims of those Black people. This is how the tangled and twisted logic of fear becomes rooted in the security apparatus of the United States. But those roots would likely erode were it not for the financial, political, and psychological investment in fear. Today, this investment takes the form of the public funding that grounds, supports, and nourishes this country's enduring logic of threat. Indeed, a key resource that maintains the racial caste system in the United States is the ever-increasing amount of public funding invested in policing and incarcerating people of color. Public funding is the lifeblood of the torture tree, and yet it remains debatable as to whether this funding has made our society any safer, especially for a person of color at the receiving end of the police violence. Of the 10 most populous cities in the United States, Chicago had the highest number of fatal shootings involving the police from 2010 to 2014. Given that these shootings are often found to be unwarranted, you may be aware that it's a common practice for civilians to sue the city and the police department. I'm sure you know that your constituents absorb the cost of those misconduct payouts, but do you realize just how massive the costs have been? Police misconduct payouts related to incidents of excessive force have increased substantially since 2004. From 2004 to 2016, Chicago has paid out $662 million in police misconduct settlements. Furthermore, there is no reason to believe that these figures will decrease. Hundreds of Chicago Police Department misconduct lawsuits were filed between 2011 and 2016, and they have cost Chicago taxpayers roughly $280 million. When I was writing this letter in July of 2018, the city had paid more than $45 million in misconduct settlements in the first 7 months of that year alone. Keep in mind that misconduct payouts are only a fraction of what the city spends on policing. Chicago allocates $1.46 billion annually to policing, or 40% of its budget. That's the second highest share of a city budget that goes to policing in the nation. I recently came across a report about the funding for police departments in several US cities. The Center for Popular Democracy, Law for Black Lives, and the Black Youth Project 100 authored it. This report is of interest to you. As I read it, one quote in particular stood out. For every dollar spent on the Chicago Police Department, the Department of Public Health, which includes mental health services, receives 2 cents. The Department of Planning and Development, which includes affordable housing development, receives 12 cents. The Department of Family and Support Services, which funds youth development, after-school programs, and homeless services, receives 5 cents. As mayor, you have the opportunity to shift these priorities. Needless to say, the way you decide to use public fundings reflects your values and the values of your constituents. Your job requires that you defend your constituents' wants and needs as you negotiate the budget with the city council members each year. I know that it will be tempting to spend huge portions of the city's budgets on the police department, especially since that is what the vast majorities of cities across the country are doing. But all across Chicago, your constituents are recognizing the problem with this approach. A Black woman named Monica knew that the city used public funding to finance police violence and to compensate the wrongly convicted, but she thought this approach was short-sighted. It can't just be money, she said. Money is not enough, she elaborated. Money doesn't fix the time that has been taken from them, nor does it fix the mental strain that has occurred. It doesn't fix their access to education or jobs. It's not enough to just give people money or to just release them from prison. There needs to be a holistic package. Monica thought that elected officials like you should work to funnel funding from police to public resources and social services. She could only hope that the wider public would start to pay attention to the present reality, the reality that every Chicagoan is financing torture every day. Case in point, on July 5th, 2018, youth of color staged a die-in at City Hall to protest Rahm Emanuel's plan to spend $95 million to build a cop academy. The young protesters set up cardboard tombstones with the names of people who had been killed by the police written on them with black ink. They also wrote the names of schools and facilities that had shuttered because of the lack of public funding. Speaking about her reasons for helping organize the event, 20-year-old Nita Tennyson said, "In my neighborhood, there is no grocery stores. We live in a food desert. There are a bunch of schools getting shut down. The mental health facilities are shut down too. And that just leaves people with nothing to do. They become a danger to themselves and to their community. But if we had those resources," she continued, referring to the funding earmarked for the police academy, "we wouldn't need the police to try to stop those people because resources would already be in place to help them." Nita's description of how the lack of resources in her community contributes to violence was laced with resentment because a vast expenditure of time and resources was being spent to clean up a problem that should not have existed in the first place. And to make matters worse, the cleanup was taking resources away from larger efforts to make life better in her community. Did you know that our country currently spends $100 billion a year on policing and $80 billion on incarceration? Well, with this trend, your political advisors might argue that adopting a tough on crime stance will be a key source of your longevity as an elected official. But if you want to address the problem of police violence and to make Chicago safer, you must resist the urge to follow the status quo. For at least 2 decades in your city, the idea of defunding the police long stood in for a call to reprioritize the way that taxpayer money is spent. It is due time to listen and then act in the service of radical transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ralph. It's a wonderful start to our evening here. Our second presenter is Dr. Christen Smith. She is an associate professor of African and African diaspora studies and anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the founder of the Cite Black Women Campaign, Collective and Movement, a Black feminist anthropologist and a social justice advocate. Her work focuses on engendered anti-Black state violence and Black community responses to it in Brazil and the Americas. Her work primarily focuses on transnational anti-Black police violence, Black liberation struggles, and the paradox of Black citizenship in the Americas, and the dialectic between the enjoyment of Black culture and the killing of Black people. Her book, Afro-Paradise, Blackness, Violence, and Performance in Brazil, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2016, uses the lens of performance to examine the immediate and long-term impact of police violence on the Black population of Salvador, Bahia, Brazil, and the grassroots movements to denounce and end this violence. Her more recent comparative work examines the lingering deadly impact of police violence on Black women in Brazil and the US. So I'm gonna turn our microphones over to Dr. Smith now.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Eshe. I appreciate it. And thank you to Danilyn and Chip and everyone at the Wenner-Gren and our panelists for sharing the space with me today. I'm going to read from my book, Afro-Paradise. I have a couple of images. And so I'm going to actually start a screen share to begin, and then I'll turn it off. Grainy home videos show a young boy kicking high and bending low in a fast-paced rhythm. To even the untrained eye, he is clearly very good. He does not miss a beat as one of his competitors slips out of the circle and another taps in, kicking, bending, and swirling with choreographed motion. 10-year-old Joel da Conceição Castro has loved capoeira his whole life. Months later, little Joel sits in front of another camera to record a commercial for Bahia Tursa, the state of Bahia's tourist agency. Sitting in a bright white t-shirt, head high with a big smile on his face, he talks about his beloved capoeira and one of his favorite people, his dad, Joel Mestre Ninha, a capoeira master. His face beams when he talks about his love for the martial art/dance. He laughs and looks up into the sky as if he knows that his inspiration and passion come from heaven. He melts our hearts with his round cheeks and brown eyes. The short recording shoots back and forth between high definition shots of little Joel's smiling face and stock shots of happy, jovial Black and white people. The scenes are interposed with images of the sun-kissed beaches of Bahia and recognizable tourist sites of the city. One of the many like it produced by Bahia Tursa, the video happily announces that Joel is the new face of Bahia, as it lists all of the reasons to make the city of Salvador your next vacation spot. It is the perfect publicity piece for a city renowned for its Black culture and Black people. I want to be a capoeira master when I grow up, just like my dad. This is the new Bahia. In the early morning hours of November 22nd, 2010, just as little Joel laid down on his mattress to get ready for bed with his dad and his siblings, Salvador's military police invaded his neighborhood of Nordeste de Amarelina. They came in shooting, as the police often do during raids on the periferia, the literal and figurative marginal zones isolated on the outskirts of urban metropolises. These communities are where the majority of Black working class people live in Brazil's major cities. A stray bullet pierces the house and strikes Joel in the face while he is lying on his mattress. Distraught, Mestre Ninha begins to desperately call out to his oldest son, Anderson, for help, assuming that his young son Joel is already dead. Anderson tries to console his father, convincing him to go out into the streets amid the firestorm to seek assistance. Anderson picks up his little brother in his arms, and he and his father desperately head outside. They go from house to house, but neighbors, fearing for their lives, do not open their doors because of the flying bullets. Mestre Nina and Anderson then run to the invading police officers for help. Either you turn back now or I'm going to do to you what I did to your son. Community members begin to rally, insisting that the police help the boy. Go get help from the people who shot him, the officers quip. The bullet came from over there, not here. The implication is that drug traffickers, quote unquote, not the police, are responsible for the shooting. Angry and exacerbated, Mestre Nina begins to argue with the officers. The crowd swells and demands that the police help the boy. A neighbor who recognizes Mestre Nina and Joel comes out to offer his assistance. He drives the three to the general hospital. Little Joel is pronounced dead later that day. Our womb misses the child that it has borne. My womb, my entrails, my spirit miss Joel. Mariam da Conceição, Joel's mother, says as she looks at the camera. Her eyes are red and filled with tears. Miriam's pain resonates with that of the countless other Black mothers who have lost their children to gendered, racialized state violence, not only in Brazil, but across the Americas. The tale of Joel da Conceição Castro encapsulates a cruel irony. There is a paradoxical relationship between Bahia's identity as an exotic Black jovial playland, where anyone, especially tourists, can enjoy Black culture and Black people, and the state's use of terror against the very Black bodies that ostensibly produce this exotic space, Afro-Paradise. This gendered, sexualized, and racialized imaginary has made the region a sizzling tourist industry on the one hand and fueled the violent repression of Black bodies on the other. These two seemingly conflicting actions are not in opposition to one another. Rather, Bahia as a space of Black fantasy and Bahia as a space of death for Black people are two sides of the same coin. Afro-Paradise is choreographed theatrical performance between the state's celebration of Black culture and the state's routine killing of the Black body. This book is an attempt to unpack this reality. Palimpsestic embodiment, this is from chapter 4. If state violence against the Black body is pain is torture, then the Black body is also a wandering ghost, and we must think of its life and its afterlife as performances. Scenes of the Black body bound by the state recall one another in ways that give us an uneasy sensation of familiarity, and this sparks our interest as onlookers and creates a profound sense of déjà vu, come recognition. The past still haunts the present. The parchment of the palimpsest, the body, is overlain by layers of violent reenactment, and the fate shadows of the text, discourses of race, violence, and the social contract, are the temporal accumulation of knowledge, sometimes conscious, sometimes subconscious, that remain embedded in the body and retained in our corporeal memory. On June 16, 2009, more than 100 civil, military, and special operations police officers invaded Canabrava, a peripheral neighborhood in the northern part of the city of Salvador. The officers summarily executed 5 young men from the community who were alleged suspects in the crime. 3 of the young men, Edmilson Ferreira dos Anjos, 22, Rogério Ferreira, 24, and Manuel Ferreira, 23, were brothers. According to their sister, the police invaded their house, pulled their mother out, and shot the boys while they were watching television on the couch and sleeping in a bedroom. Distraught with grief, the mother of the 3, who identified herself to journalists as Maria da Conceição, denied that her boys had any involvement with drug trafficking or homicide. That same week, police took 3 other suspects in Teixeira's murder into police custody. The wounds that Black women suffer as a result of state terror are multi-layered. When the police come, women do not know whether they will be killed. And when the police do not kill them, they often kill their children or loved ones, irrevocably affecting their physical and emotional health and well-being. When we assess the damage caused by state violence, we then must calculate it beyond body count. We must also consider its communal effects, particularly with regard to the Black family. This discussion genders our reading of Afro-Paradise and the political stakes associated with it. It also marks Black women and Black families as primary targets. Most often, Black women are the ones who watch the police drag their family members out of the house to be killed, a kind of perverse torture that few studies of violence name as such. And if the families of the dead are not only witnesses of state terror, but also victims, then their survival is a political act. Reframing, I can't breathe. So my book looks at police violence, this is an aside, through the lens of performance, and particularly a play about anti-Blackness in Brazil. In that play, during the reenactment of a police raid, a woman from the audience interjects the name of her neighborhood as performers recite the names of communities in Bahia that had been invaded by the police. In the last chapter, I analyzed this interjection, which is plataforma. To close, I want to revisit this analysis, but I also want to suggest that we think of plataforma alongside the phrase, I can't breathe. Back to the text. Alan Feldman employs Nadia Sterimatakis' use of antiphonal witnessing to analyze the practice of call and response, witnessing among Black women in South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, tying it to the indigenous practices among the Xhosa as well. The Xhosa word, phefumula, refers to the soul, but as Feldman points out, it also refers to breath, phefumlo, and implies that, and I quote, a person in mourning, a person harboring great suffering and emotional stress, experiences a heavy weight on the chest and shoulders and cannot breathe easily. Speech is exhaling the soul, the release of blockage, and an emergence from social death that is incomplete unless it is witnessed and historicized by congregational modes of performance rather than passive recording. Plataforma, I can't breathe, is phefumla. I release breath that emerges from the soul, and as such, a mode of witnessing that signals the speaker's representation at the moment as an embodiment of the absent, dead, and suffering. To witness state violence and survive it is to refuse to forget the names of the dead that have been effaced by the myth of Afro-Paradise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. That was wonderful. I think we've got a lot to talk about and think about there. And hopefully we can revisit that after. For the moment, I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Dr. Savannah Shange is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, with research interests in circulated and lived forms of Blackness, ethnographic ethics, Afro-pessimism, and queer of color critique. Dr. Shange works at the intersections of race, place, sexuality, and the state. In Progressive Dystopia, Abolition, Anti-Blackness, and Schooling in San Francisco, published in 2019 at Duke University Press, Dr. Shange explores the potential for reconciling the Robeson Justice Academy's marginalization of Black students with the sincere pursuit of multiracial uplift and solidarity. She outlines how the school fails in its students and the community because it operates within a space predicated on anti-Blackness. Seeing San Francisco as a social laboratory for how Black communities survive the end of the world, Dr. Shange argues for abolition over revolution or progressive reform as the needed path towards Black freedom. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shange. Please share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eshe, for the introduction and for bringing us together, and of course, Danilyn and Chip for inviting us. I'm also going to share a image just to ground the excerpt that I'm sharing, and I'll take it off as well. In the fall of 2014, the website of the Robeson Justice Academy prominently featured an image, this one, of 200 or so mostly brown hands raised in the air, some resolute, some reluctant. The young people are crowded onto a crumbling blacktop basketball court holding signs that read, "Hands up, don't shoot," and "Murder is a crime." The whole school photo shoot was organized by youth leaders with the consent of school staff and taken 1 week after a grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri refused to charge police officer Darren Wilson in the killing of Black teenager Michael Brown. The now iconic "Hands up, don't shoot" gesture embodied by Robeson students was part of a wave of marches, rebellions, and digitally mediated forms of protest across the United States. In the city of San Francisco itself, neighbors rose up in response to the state killings of Jessica Williams, Mario Woods, Luis Gongora Pat, Amilcar Perez Lopez, and Alex Nieto. While across the Bay Area, the murders of Stephon Clark, Oscar Grant, Gary King Jr. sparked rallies and vigils. Hands Up, Don't Shoot juxtaposes a physical pose of surrender with the palpable presence of communal power, is at once a plea and a demand, one that challenges the fatal power of the state and its armed agents. While associated with the police killing of Mike Brown, the broader social movement that has coalesced nationally around the murders of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Kareem Gaines, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and now we would add Rayshard Brooks, Remy Fells, Rhea Milton, extends this demand beyond the spectacle of police killing to include an array of violences wrought by the state. For the Movement for Black Lives, M4BL, one of the root organizations of which Laurence brought up with the BYP 100, state violence takes many forms, and I'm bringing this in from the M4BL platform. It includes a systemic underinvestment in our communities, the caging of our people, predatory state and corporate practices targeting our neighborhoods, government policies that result in the poisoning of our water and the theft of our land, failing schools that criminalize rather than educate our children, economic practices that extract our labor, and wars on our trans and queer family that deny them their humanity. Articulated by Black activists working across the US, including the very neighborhood where Robeson Justice Academy is located, this multi-layered depiction of the harms of the state belies any simplistic or unitary approach to the state itself. Each mode of dispossession named is at work in the communities of Southeast San Francisco. The Hunters Point Toxic Superfund site abuts a huge public housing development. Extractive urban development schemes have stripped the Fillmore, Mission, and Soma neighborhoods of their Black, Latinx, and Filipino economic bases. Robeson Justice Academy itself has struggled and continues to struggle with over-punishing Black students. But by splashing Our Lives Matter as a photo, as a header on its website, the Robeson School made a claim on Blackness, as does the broader multiracial progressive movement that enlists Blackness as a central conceit of people of color politics. But when our lives matter, it is only in their ourness that Black lives matter, because they, or we, are one of us. And yet, as progressive dystopia demonstrates, being hurt, being mistrustful, being unapologetically Black can get both students and teachers expelled from us because we no longer deserve to be in this special place or be a citizen of this ad hoc social justice polity. The Robeson Justice Academy is a small, resistant, progressive, and yet eminently civil society, the meniscus of which is kept taut by the internalized policing required under the regime of carceral progressivism and punctuated by the spectacle of Black expulsion from its exceptional space. The lethal distance between our and Black in the mattering of lives is particularly instructed at a moment where democratic socialism has re-entered the political discourse with the two Bernie Sanders presidential bids. From bumper stickers in the parking lot to zealous Facebook posts, the staff members at this high school were vocal about their support of the Sanders candidacy. Though Sanders lost twice, Black people and people of color were the presumed beneficiaries of a democratic socialist presidency. But this presumption fails because Black flesh is always in excess, uncivil, and marked by its incongruity with the progressive project to which we are narratively central, but materially surplus. Progressivism is fundamentally a reconstructionist politic embedded within liberal logics. It aims to hold the state accountable to its promise of democracy and justice. While the protagonist of progressivism's political narrative has expanded from the white working class to include the Black underclass, the brown undocumented migrant, its story is still fundamentally a state romance. Social justice means living happily ever after with the anti-racist, distributive state. Abolition is a messy breakup with a state, rending, not reparation. Antecedent to its location as a disciplinary mode, what we might practice as an abolitionist anthropology is a genre of Black study. For Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, study is what you do with other people. It's talking and walking with other people, working, dancing, suffering, some irreducible convergence of all three, held under the name of speculative practice. The point for them of calling it study is to mark the incessant and irreversible intellectuality of these activities is already present. The speculative practice of study, as sketched by Moten and Harney, is immediately recognizable to all of us as fieldwork, right? For anthropologists of Black people in the Americas, that fieldwork is never completely out of sight of another set of fields: cotton, cane, tobacco, rice. Our real time is stitched together from plantation futures, a variegated time space called forth from the hold of the ship. the social life of the socially dead. This mode of heterotemporal study then also invokes the speculative practice of Black science fiction writers like Octavia Butler, N.K. Jemisin, Nalo Hopkinson, whose willingness to dream other worlds inspires my rendering of this one. If, as Christina Sharp posits, the question for theory is how to live in the wake of slavery and slavery's afterlives, the afterlife of property, how, in short, to inhabit and rupture this episteme with our knowable lives, an abolitionist anthropology finds its answers in the register of the quotidian, in the cruddy, ordinary facts of Blackness. Though I don't seek to make Black lives knowable, as Sharp suggests, given the tendency towards hubris that can swell under the skin of thick description, in this book, I try to offer a few glimpses of Bay Area Blackness as it inhabits and ruptures this episteme of late liberalism. Significant here is the dyadic relationship between inhabiting, living, and rupturing, destruction, the syncopation or two-step between the present durative tense of Black survivance and the future perfect of abolition. In this sense, abolitionist anthropology is in rhythm with what Beth Pavanelli calls the sociology of potentiality, while still getting down on the one of endurance. Progressive dystopia is an attempt to engage anthropology as a practice of abolition and ethnography of the afterlife of slavery as lived in the sucker-free city. Abolition here is not a synonym for resistance. It encompasses the ways in which Black people and our accomplices work within, against, and beyond the state in the service of collective liberation. As an analytic, abolition requires specificity, the very kinds of granularity that ethnography offer, as an accounting of the daily practices that facilitate Black material and symbolic death. Abolitionist anthropology then is an ethic and a scholarly mode that attends to the interface between the multi-sided anti-Black state and those who seek to survive it. In the process of unthinking the state, abolitionist anthropology joins 2 generations, at least, of attempts to reconceive a disciplinary project built on extractive logics, collusion, anti-Blackness, colonialism. Emerging from deep relationality with ancestors and contemporaries, its practice is a mode of reparative caring that seeks to be accountable to what is unaccounted for in social reform schemes. I didn't write the book as like a manual to be like a better, more radical anthropologist. I only offer it as a provocation to care more than we can know, to extend our analyses past the ruins of the world and maybe even the discipline as we know it. At the 2014 convening of the Movement for Black Lives in Cleveland, there was an almost constant musical presence in the courtyards and on the street corners surrounding the conference events that attracted hundreds of Black organizers, educators, cultural workers from across the US. Various chants and songs were shared across regions and generations, and each cipher accumulated with the same infectious refrain. I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. Sung at the top of our lungs as we jumped up and down or variously wiggled our body parts in rhythm with our faith in Black life. I believe that we will win is an abolitionist mantra that conjures a course to freedom. Its utterance is an affirmation of Black autonomy. And in the context of a gathering that centered prison abolitionists and Black land activists, I believe that we will win is a ritual practice of internalizing the necessity to do the impossible. While the Our Lives Matter photo that opened this excerpt issues from that same impulse to preserve and protect Black life, it redirected the rage of young people to the realm of the doable. Arrest the officer, don't shoot unarmed civilians, protect Black and brown youth from state execution. By focusing on the incremental rollout of revolutionary programming, the everyday practice of progressive reformers in places like Robeson Justice Academy is tethered to the temporality of success. Look what we won, right? Progressive dystopia tries to map the tension between these 2 tenses of victory. I believe that we will win, and look what we won, and amplifies the lessons that Frisco fugitives have for us as we dream an impossible world in which their lives, in fact, do matter.
Thank you, Dr. Shange. I thank you for pushing us to situate ourselves and to put ourselves in space and time in that continuum. Thank you. I'm going to introduce our final speaker, and then we will have lots of time to open up the floor and the forum for questions and discussion. So our final presenter is Dr. Deborah A. Thomas. She is the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology and the Director of the Center of Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests include the afterlives of imperialism, in what new forms of community, subjectivity, and expectation are produced by violence, and how these are expressed and mapped. She is the author of a number of books, including Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Sovereignty, Witnessing, Repair, published in 2019, Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica in 2011, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica in 2004. She is also co-director and co-producer of 2 films. First, Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, a documentary that chronicles the history of violence in Jamaica through the eyes of its most iconic community, Rastafari. And the second, 4 Days in May, Kingston, 2010, an experimental documentary that juxtaposes archives related to the Tivoli incursion in May 2010, when Jamaican security forces entered West Kingston to arrest Christopher Coke, wanted for extradition to the United States, and killed at least 25 civilians. We're so happy to have you here, Dr. Thomas. Mike's all yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you for that, Eshe, and thank you, Danilyn and Chip, for inviting us to come together. Thank you to my fellow panelists. It's really good to see all of you. I feel like the last 3 months have been so sequestered, so it's really wonderful to see some friendly, familiar faces. Like Christen and Savannah, I'm going to read while I show you a short film, a short nonlinear, non-narrative film, which is really how this project started. It started as a visual project, and it sort of ended up as a book, but it wasn't initially intended to be a book. And the visual project is one that I worked on collaboratively with Junior Wedderburn and Deanne Bell. So I'm going to show you one iteration of that while I read from the book. During the week of 24 May 2010, with a US surveillance drone overhead, oh, I thought this didn't have the sound. Sorry, I'm going to show it without the sound. During the week of 24 May 2010, with a US surveillance drone overhead, members of the Jamaican police force and the army entered the West Kingston community of Tivoli Gardens to apprehend Christopher Dudus Coke, who had been ordered for extradition to stand trial in the United States on gun and drug running charges. In August 2009, when the United States issued the extradition request for Coke, Bruce Golding, then Prime Minister, leader of the Jamaica Labour Party, and member of Parliament for Tivoli Gardens, argued against the extradition on the procedural grounds that the evidence against Coke was obtained by wiretapping, which is illegal under Jamaican law. But by the 3rd week in May 2010, under pressure from Parliament and the US government, Golding announced to the nation on television that he had authorized the Attorney General to sign the extradition order. This led to a standoff between the security forces that had to find Coke and many of Coke's supporters who were bent on protecting him at any cost. By the end of the week, Coke had not yet been found, and at least 75 civilians were officially recognized as having been killed. The number community members give is closer to 200. The government established a curfew for Tivoli Gardens, and residents were forced to show passes when leaving or entering. Most movement in or out of the community was effectively stopped, which meant that many people were unable to work, to go to school, to shop for food, or to go about the ordinary routines of their lives. This continued until the 22nd of June, when Coke was detained and subsequently extradited. Despite the immediate activities of various civil society organizations, it took almost 3 years for the Office of the Public Defender to submit an interim report to Parliament regarding the conduct of the security forces. The Commission of Inquiry that was called for by the Public Defender's report of April 2014 finally got underway in December of that year and submitted its report to Parliament in June 2016. But the full scope of political violence in Jamaica has not been publicly aired or accounted for. These are the events that were the impulse for political life in the wake of the plantation. And this is a book that seeks to answer the following questions. What does it mean to be human politically in the wake of the plantation? How have people confronted the unpredictable afterlives of colonialism and slavery, nationalism and state formation in ways that perform not only a material, but also an affective transformation? What forms of community and expectation are produced in and through violence? And what does modern sovereignty feel like? These questions have been haunting me over the past 12 years, during which I've been developing archives of the relationships between sovereignty and violence in Jamaica. My specific obsessions have had to do with the temporal regimes to which post-colonial sovereignty projects have been tethered. I've wanted to know how these regimes have conditioned the affective states through which sovereignty projects are enacted and experienced, and how they have shaped the complex processes of subjectivity within a modernity whose foundational infrastructures were imperialism, colonization, and plantation-based slavery. I've been interested in what Sylvia Wynter identified as a constitutive tension between the dominant logic of the plantation, a logic that undergirds all modern sovereignty projects, and its internal threat, the often millennial spaces within which enslaved people maintained a conception of themselves as human rather than as property. It is this tension that would ultimately shape the relationship between the national and the popular in struggles over sovereignty. And it's this tension that becomes legible by ethnographically attending to both moments of exceptional violence and to the realm of everyday practice. My aim throughout the book is to bear witness to these dynamics in the kind of quiet and quotidian way Tina Kampt has identified as a modality of refusal, the quote, nimble and strategic practices that undermine the categories of the dominant. Witnessing, as implied here, is neither straightforward nor unmediated. Rather, it's ambivalent and relationally complex. My agenda in these pages is to juxtapose assemblages of archives, visual, oral, historical, colonial, and post-colonial, in order to think through the relations they bring into being among the psychic, material, prophetic, and political dimensions of sovereignty, the broader historical and geopolitical entanglements they make visible, and the possibilities they generate for a redefinition of human recognition. The form of witnessing that interests me, one I'm calling Witnessing 2.0, is not the witnessing of human rights organizations or of public tribunals such as Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Witnessing 2.0 is instead an embodied practice. It makes visible the way affects operate in multiple temporalities and across levels of consciousness. By focusing on the extent to which one recognizes the various ways we're implicated in the processes we address, Witnessing 2.0 both produces intimacies through the development of affective archives and reveals the ways we maintain the conjunctures of power within which we live. Because the technologies through which we witness potentially exceed these conjunctures, however, Witnessing 2.0 offers us windows into what Walter Benjamin called the quote, tiny spark of contingency, that spark that might produce something unexpected and that might reformulate the ground of the human outside of modernist binaries. It is a practice of recognition and love that destabilizes the boundaries between self and other, knowing and feeling, complicity and accountability. Witnessing 2.0 can therefore ultimately produce the internal shifts in consciousness that radiate from one to another in unexpected and necessarily nonlinear ways, and that lead to lasting, world-changing transformations. What I argue throughout this text is that we must cultivate archives through attentive embodied care in order to recognize and respond to the psychic and socio-political dynamics in which we are complicit, and therefore to generate the ability to be responsible to ourselves and to others. My discussion of the narratives we collected from residents of Tivoli Gardens and of the forms of evidence given at the West Kingston Commission of Inquiry suggests that the dominant affective register of neoliberalism is doubt. My treatment of Claudius Henry and his International Peacemakers Association as it flourished and then declined between 1966 and 1986 leads to an exegesis of an affective field of expectancy. And my discussion of the ways Rastafari and communism became conjoined during the height of the Cold War and of US intervention into the trade union movement after the expulsion of the radical wing of the People's National Party in 1952 is shot through with paranoia. If archives of affect are produced in and through these particular socio-political affective fields, then they also generate particular technologies through which we experience, confront, and interpret these fields. These technologies also sediment over time and in relation to fields that have come before, thereby generating our contemporary landscape of the political. For the context I'm describing here, doubt produces technologies of misrecognition, the result of obfuscation, denial, and the maintenance of public secrets. Expectancy produces technologies of prophetic waiting, a waiting in which the end is never the end because it was foretold from the beginning. Paranoia finally produces technologies of surveillance and conspiracy. Friends turn against friends, and what you see is never what you get. Where doubt and paranoia short-circuit the future, focus on the present, and evacuate the past, expectancy generates new worlds for the future. Each of these affective socio-political fields is therefore tied not only to the temporal materialities that contextualize it, but also to different versions of social and political change. The assemblage of these moments also creates a story about how entanglements change over time, and one that is therefore about the dissolution of British imperialism and the shifting vectors of American empire. It tells us about what kinds of political imagination are possible, whether diasporic, Pan-African, or non-aligned, at different temporal junctures. It also tells us about how certain places, Jamaica in this case, become central to knowledge production about the important questions of their day. Throughout political life, Jamaica emerges as critical, not only in relation to the transition from British to American hegemony across the Western Hemisphere, but also to the development of a perception of insecurity in the United States, one that was generated by the circulations of drugs, communism, and Black radicalism, but also by spies, money, and diplomats. Reflecting on what he termed the dismal state of record keeping and maintenance in Jamaica, Tony Harriott once suggested to me that, quote, the attitude to history is indicative of the attitude to accountability. This ultimately speaks to the ethical impulses of this project and the questions that frame the coda. How are we complicit in sovereign violence? To whom are we accountable? What are our obligations? And what might real liberation feel like? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. That was wonderful. Thank you to all of our panelists for speaking with us. I just realized that I fudged the name of Dr. Ralph's book. It is not Torture, what did I say, Trees? It is Torture Letters. My apologies. Thank you all again for being with us and presenting your wonderful work. I think we are all better for having been here and listening to you read. I know we have plenty of time now to open up the floor for questions. I think we're going to start with a few that Chip has. So I'm going to turn this over to him and we can get right into it. Chip?
Great, thank you so much, Eshe, and thanks to all the panelists for sharing your really important books and being with everyone tonight. I'm going to start off with a few questions. Some of the other co-hosts might have some questions, but I would definitely encourage all of you in the audience there to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to ask your own questions so that we can invite you into the conversation. So to begin, I thought I would ask my first question by about how in all of the books, in all 4 of the books that we were hearing about tonight, one could say there is a kind of convergence between past, present, and future. The past histories of institutionalized racism, state violence, anti-Black hate, and more all continue to play out in the present. And how we deal with this past right now is going to shape our future for potentially generations to come. So one question I have then is, how can societies successfully address the past right now? Can we individually and collectively redress past harms that continue in the present to create a new future? I think maybe another way of asking this is, in the different contexts you work, what does quote unquote repair look like, and is that even a possibility? And so maybe the panelists, if you'd like to unmute all, or whoever would like to jump in first, that would be great.
I can start for this one. I noticed the conversion right away as well, both in the work, but also in the movements on the ground that we're each talking about. And I think that for my case, I started off by researching a police scandal about torture that had been going on for decades. And I was confronted with the kind of the iterations that Christen was talking about, in which you constantly get the cyclical nature of the same kinds of violence recurring. And so the question then becomes, how are people living with this history? And what forms of redress are they requesting in any given moment? But also, through those forms of redress, how are new futures becoming imagined, which is how Savannah ended. And in particular, in my case, a big part of the story of police torture in Chicago is a reparation ordinance that was ruled in 2015, which gave collective resources to the survivors of torture. And it was different from the settlements that I talked about, because it wasn't based on an individual being harmed, but based on the city providing collectively for all torture survivors. And so collective resources like education for the torture survivors, a torture justice center being built, in which they could get counseling, a statute in which the history of the torture scandal would be taught in public schools. And so it was a landmark decision in the sense that this was a more holistic and collective way of thinking about redress. But the limitations speak to, again, what Savannah was mentioning in her reading, and that is the onus is still on the communities themselves to heal. And it's not aimed at systematic transformation in policing. It's not aimed at addressing legislation that would seek to answer the question, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? It's seen as something that happened in the past, and therefore it can be reconciled in the present. But the question is, again, what has changed in the structure to prevent this from happening again? And when we fail to answer that question, then we get the kind of iterations that Christen was talking about. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
I think I can jump in. I think your question is really apt, Chip, in terms of how can society address these past harms. I think there's 2 pieces. One, And Christen, Deb, and Laurence, each of you spoke in different ways to that. We're actually not talking about addressing past harm. We're talking about addressing ongoing harm, right? In just the past 3 weeks, we see that the pace of the execution of Black people has actually not changed, right? There's not an increase in police violence or police killing. It's not like a spike. Black life has been the spike of violence. I think it's really important for us to, with our temporality, understand the ongoingness of anti-Black violence. And the anti-Black violence isn't just in the settler state, right? The incursion on Tivoli Gardens is also anti-Black violence. It is this kind of disposability of Black life. When we think of it as an ongoing temporality, I think society as a structure cannot address those past harms, right? Distinct from the social, right? So I think the locus of the social as a site of healing, a site of repair, is very different from the infrastructure of society. Because if you look at the central kind of foundational harms, again, Laurence, you spoke to this, of genocide, which is also ongoing, slavery, which never ended. Depending on who you talk to, the cash reparations for slavery start at $51 trillion, right? That's not accounting for ongoing police murder, right? It's not accounting for ongoing extraction, and is only talking about the people who continue to live in the US, not the millions across the diaspora. It doesn't count folks in Bahia, right? So once you start adding that up, the response is, well, you can't do that. You would bankrupt the United States. And so that is where the conversation starts. The repair is the cost of bankrupting the state as we know it, literally. Then when we go to, that's just within the structure as we know. If we talk about even the foundational land that we're on, I speak to you from Chochenyo Ohlone land, which has been unceded, right? I'm in a rented house. I pay rent to a landlord who has a deed to land that is still not covered by a treaty with the United States. And so with the evacuation of the deeds, which is the demand of Native folks, that you evacuate these deeds and renegotiate the way that you live in relationship to this land and to these people, that is the beginning of the conversation. So I don't think that society as we know it can hold these twin demands. And I do think that the social has the capacity to face them and move somewhere closer together.
Do you see that happening on the ground, Dr. Shange?
Demands for reparations and by land and Black people?
Yeah, in terms of the ways in which those demands are unfolding now. Do you
Absolutely.
see that's progressing?
I don't think it's just a US project. And certainly in Jamaica and in Brazil, there are folks who are shifting relationships to the land. I'm sure both of you, Deb and Christen, can speak to ways that people are really challenging the legitimacy of the state as the arbiter of people's relationship to land, property, and really challenging private property itself. And so I think we've seen some of those challenges of private property quite recently. I don't divorce that impulse to the impulse of saying all of this is part of the tab.
Yeah, I'll just add something just to say that, this is, as everybody has indicated, obviously a global issue. And, what is required is sort of a different kind of contemporary realization that, of course, these are not past problems, and sort of acknowledging the place of the past in the present, which is something people only occasionally appear to feel ready to do. And in a place like Jamaica, where racism seems like a problem of the United States, and anti-Black racism isn't always conceptualized as such in a majority Black country. We know, of course, that if you substitute poor for Black in every anti-Black formulation in the US, you end up with what we see in Jamaica. And I'll just mention, Jamaica has one of the highest extrajudicial killing rates in the world. And Daniel Thwaites had an interesting column in the Gleaner about a week ago, because people in Jamaica have been particularly outraged about what happened with George Floyd. And there was a lot of activity in social media denouncing denouncing this. And so this column is about, okay, well, let's look at what this would look like here, you know, because of course we care about anti-Black violence in the United States, but we care about police violence in Jamaica. And so what he writes is that if Jamaicans were killed at the rate that US Blacks are killed by US law enforcement, there would be about 20 such deaths annually. On the other hand, if Blacks in the US were treated like Jamaicans are treated by the Jamaican police, instead of around 260 to 300 annual deaths, there would be somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000. So it's, the problem is also racism as a process that works in all societies, not just majority white societies, and to really think about what those legacies are related to and how that has led to the forms of inequality that we still see that allow for some people to be killed with impunity by the police, as Christen has also demonstrated.
I just want to add something. Thank you for all of the panelists who just kind of gave a rich perspective on the question. So I don't want to repeat what you all have said, but I do want to add something because I think I agree with everything that you just said. You know, obviously, question of land is one of the important in Brazil. The landless movement, the homeless movement are really at the vanguard of these movements around the world. And so when folk are talking about homeless movements and landless movements, they look to Brazil in a lot of ways. And we all know that the majority of the folk who are affected by those issues are Black in Brazil in that particular context. And I also think that the numbers that Deb was just giving about Jamaica are parallel to Brazil, obviously. I mean, what we should all be aware of, and this goes to my point, and so maybe I'll make my point first and make it quick, but also come back to what I want to say about what we should all be aware of. And I believe that the answer to your question, Chip, is in part radical honesty. And so what I see that is deeply unsettling to me is a tendency to gaslight the issue of anti-Black state violence by using the framework of racism and interpersonal discrimination in order to distract from the fundamental issue of the history and contemporary reality of the state killing Black people, not only with impunity, but with purpose and focus. And so I think that part of the issue, and I echo what Deb said, it's, you know, we're living in that past. For those of us that do this work, we don't really see a whole lot of change over time. I think I was looking at Michelle Alexander's new introduction to the new Jim Crow, and she talked about the fact that everything has changed and nothing has changed. And that is exactly how we feel. But I think that part beyond just the repetition of history or the continuation of a genealogy is also the fact that we have not had a reckoning. And we are starting to look like we might have a reckoning, but it's still not a reckoning. Anytime the response of society is to produce statements, produce statements and change the, what's the word I'm looking for? Change the mascot of your syrup, but not actually deal with the fact that Black people are being killed systematically, then we are not at a point where we are even dealing with the present, not to mention the past. And so I think that that radical honesty is absolutely critical and goes hand in hand with the acknowledgement of what's really going on. And so the last point that I'll make is, you know, we don't even have good statistics on police killings. I don't know how many people really understand that, but it wasn't until Ferguson that people actually started to pressure the FBI recognizing that they weren't counting all of the killings. There's still not full transparency. Many of these killings are misclassified. That's a transnational issue. And so the numbers that Deb just put out there are really actually only the ones that are being officially counted, not to mention the ones that are unofficially dying. And so the numbers that we have for Brazil, people look at them and they're like, this is appalling, 6 people are getting killed per day. Those are the people that the police are admitting to killing. What about the people that the police said is suicide by cop, which doesn't count? What about the people who the police planted the gun on and said they shot themselves? What about the people, you know, I mean, so we have an astronomical problem here. And honesty is at the very heart of how we need to address it.
Thank you. My next question actually pivots off your book, Professor Smith. In the excerpt that you read for us tonight, we heard how terrifyingly the Salvador military police burst into the neighborhood of Nordeste de Armelina, if my Portuguese is close there, with guns ablazing, as well as you talked about other forms of, you know, really horrific state violence. And although you're describing Brazil, you know, those events could have happened in many places around the world, as you know, we heard about from some of the other panelists as well. What I'd like to ask is, can all of you speak to the deeper political history that underlies why governments give themselves this power of violence, and how citizens have both assented to this violence and resisted this power?
I'll go first, since you started by mentioning my work. I think that you know, part of the reason why I showed those images, and I know that they are difficult images, particularly the ones with the police officers stepping on two black men's heads 10 years apart in different cities, is because when I heard and I saw just a snippet of the video of George Floyd's lynching, because I did not watch the whole thing, I cannot watch the whole thing. When I saw that, I immediately thought of the way that those embodied practices of killing Black people are repeated over time and space. And I think that when we look around and wonder why are these things repeating themselves, we have to understand our hemispheric roots in colonialism and slavery, and the fact that across this hemisphere, at least in my research and most of the places where I know there was a substantial presence of slavery, Brazil and the United States particularly, the history of policing is tied to slave patrols. And so the police were never designed to protect and serve. They were always conceptualized to control the threat of Black rebellion. And so when we realize that, and we realize that at the very root of policing as we know it is white supremacy, is colonialism, is slavery, then we can understand, especially as anthropologists, how ideologically and culturally it would be difficult to move oneself away from that framing, that structural, historical, cultural framing, right? Through simple trainings or suggestions of trying to do differently. We as anthropologists know that's not how cultures change. And policing is a deep-seated, deep-rooted cultural artifact of the American nation state, and I say all of the Americas. And it is one of the legacies of the ways that white supremacy is literally braided into the fabric of our national structures, and that is across our hemisphere. And so when we understand that, then we realize that these patterns of policing, these choreographies of policing that I call them, these performances of policing, the way that you literally have an officer kneeling on somebody's neck and killing him here in Minneapolis, and officers stepping on people's heads in Brazil over time, those are learned and embodied actions that get repeated through time. And that's why I think performance is so important for the way we understand this, because even if the officer is not thinking, okay, let me go kill this person. The literal embodiment of policing as we know it is based on a logic of killing Black people. And so that in and of itself allows us to kind of open up and think differently about how we process things and how we think about them through time and space.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that except to put a kind of finer point on the fact that I think most Americans, when they're imagining what would it be like without a police force, what does it mean to abolish the police, they don't know that every transformation in policing has really been instantiated by Black rebellion throughout the Americas. It's true in Jamaica. The first attempt to establish an all-island police force in Jamaica came the year after the massive island-wide strikes that was sort of the beginning of the end of slavery for the British Empire. The first establishment of a constabulary force happened after the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. You know, these are moments of the control of Black bodies in space, and I think people don't here and elsewhere don't really know that and don't really understand that. So along with the honesty, I think there's really a need for thinking about what the origins of some of our systems are throughout the hemisphere and in the United States. And that would lead to, I think, a broader recognition of how structures are fundamentally flawed.
Thank you for both those points. Really insightful. Why don't I pass the mic back to Eshe? Eshe, I think you had a question you wanted to ask.
I do. So I will ask this question and then maybe offer some more context in terms of what I'm talking about here. But so I'll just go ahead and read this first. So these 4 books demonstrate that anti-Black racism and political violence are not confined to the USA, and where they show up in other countries, they're shaped by cultural and political histories of those spaces. Dr. Thomas, I'm wondering if you could, and you've touched on this already, and I think we're definitely getting, Dr. Smith as well is really painting a very vivid picture for us of how anti-Black racism plays out outside of the United States. But I'm particularly wondering about the case of Jamaica, because I think that it is, at least in the United States, it's a lot easier to talk about, a context in which we have a smaller population of African descendants and then a larger white population, but Jamaica is a predominantly Black country. And so it can be very difficult to think about anti-Black racism in that space, what that looks like, particularly when a lot of the members of the police forces, a lot of the people who are meting out this violence are themselves Black. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. And I'm also wondering for the rest of the authors, how comparing your sites to either other sites in the United States with regard to political violence, or I guess in the case of Dr. Smith to Brazil, how understanding those contexts give us a better understanding of how we might effectively address it. I do feel that some of this has definitely been touched on, so please feel free to, say something that you haven't said or just not say anything.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different ways to think about the question that you're posing. And the way I try to elaborate in most of my classes and in the book and most public fora has to do with an understanding of racialization and racism that is a global formation, and that is actually the grounds of modernity. So when we think about the that as an inaugural moment for a new set of organizing of human beings, of white Europeans, of Native Americans, and of Black people who are brought to facilitate a plantation economy system. So I think in order to really understand the current conjuncture of racism, we have to understand that modernity is founded on racism, you know, that the political and economic systems that we take for granted in terms of, you know, a liberal democratic state, a capitalist economic system, that the root of those all is within the conquest of the American hemisphere and the distribution of varying degrees of humanity or non-humanity among these different groups of people. So I say that to say that it's not tethered to a project of discrimination, which is the language that is often used by institutions, or a need for diversity. It actually is about a sort of foundational problem that sort of defines the ways that we think about life. That doesn't mean that it defines us every minute, every day, that we don't make life, that we don't make joy within these conditions. And I think it's really important to recognize that. But it is to say that this isn't a problem of relative skin color. This is a systemic problem, you know, and it's a problem that's embedded in all of our sort of institutions that we take for granted. And when we're teaching students about this, they don't imagine that. They don't understand a system other than a state, interstate system or an international system. They don't have access to imagining actually existing socialism or socialist systems in the way that somebody from my generation, for example, would. So it's hard to really untether them from the kind of normativities, and not just them, but generally untether people from the normative assumptions that we make about how the world works, and understanding that those assumptions are all based in this kind of foundational racist moment. The other way to think about it, I think, is to also understand that, you know, none of the developments that we see in Jamaica, for example, or in Brazil from the sort of first third of the 20th century on, and in many cases prior to that, and in Jamaica, certainly prior to that, can be understood outside of the influence of the United States. You know, the United States provided both personnel and monetary support for so did Canada, obviously so did Great Britain when it was still a British colony. The United States has intervened militarily and economically and politically in every single country in the Western Hemisphere throughout the 20th century. There isn't really a way to talk about developments in any Western Hemispheric state without thinking through these kinds of entanglements and what these histories are. Why do we have a series of military dictatorships in Brazil? What does that have to do with a US-backed coup of a socialist leader in the 1960s, in Guyana in the 1950s, in Jamaica in the 1970s, and so on and so on and so on? So like one way to think about it is through this longer sort of understanding of the ways that we have constructed political and economic systems that now seem so dominant and so sedimented, we can't think outside of them. And another is to think of really actual instances of this kind of transnational, some would say cooperation, others would say intervention and repression that are really common, you know, throughout the 20th and early 21st century. That's why I mentioned at the very beginning that there's a US surveillance drone overhead during the entire Tivoli incursion. Limited success in terms of the surveillance that they were actually able to provide. That's a whole other kind of story to tell. But there is interest, you know, in every context in all of these historical moments.
I was gonna just answer quickly about Brazil and then pass it to my colleagues because I don't want to talk too much. I just want to say that in addition to everything that's being said, you know, there are actual concrete ways that we can make the connections between spaces. And so, for example, in my book, one of the things that I talk about is torture in Chicago, right? In particular, thinking about Laurence's work, right? And about the Black site in Chicago, and about the fact that one of the folk who was one of the torturers in Chicago was also stationed in Guantanamo, and was one of the torturers in Guantanamo. And so when we think of, and we can't separate that out, for example, from the fact that all of these programs in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, particularly training police forces, right? The connection between School of the Americas and the training of torture and patterns of torture. And so death squads in Brazil still embody the teachings of the School of the Americas, and so much so that you can see patterns in death squads in Brazil that are similar to patterns in death squads in places like Iran, or Iraq, sorry, not Iran, in places like Iraq. And so these things are they're not only conceptual and speculative connections, they're also actual connections that I think we really need to be clear on. And we need to be clear on that, primarily because any response to policing right now has got to include the imperialist dimensions of policing and the fact that it is a transnational process. And so if we are just worried about trying to defund the police in the United States, and we don't think about those transnational dimensions and the way that US imperialism operates on a global policing logic, then we are going to really miss the mark on some of the key things that we need to do.
I think both of you have spoken so much to the transnational element of how this violence is constructed, particularly on the transnational shape of these kinds of extractive measures, whether at the state level or the actual training of officers. I think it's important that we also understand that Black people are transnational, right? And so Deb taught us 15 years ago that Jamaica is wherever Jamaicans are, right? So we talk about African Americans and police violence, but Abner Louima, who's raped by NYPD as a Haitian person, ignited almost 25 years ago one of the most powerful ongoing movements against police brutality, the October 22nd Coalition. Amadou Diallo is from Guinea, right? And so I think it's important that we don't first linguistically even use the phrase African Americans. There's specific things talk about Black Americanness, yes. Violence and the expendability of our bodies all across space is not one of them. And so I think it's important that we also understand that each of these thefts of life reverberates across the Americas, right? It can't be encapsulated by the state structure any more than can the instruments of that violence.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. And I think I just want to talk a little bit about the implications for anthropology. And so at the same time that we understand the expansiveness of anti-Black violence, we are studying the almost like micro instances of it in a particular context. And so, again, I think it goes back to Christen's point on choreography and studying the exact ways that these particular moments in time mirror each other. And through kind of the experiential and the bodily and the practice of policing, but also the way that they have the same material effects in terms of the way that institutions work and the implications that means for people. And so one thing I really find generative in Deb's work is the idea of the public secret or the open secret. And that is tied into the long histories of everything that we've been talking about. And what I've been talking about in particular in relationship to the investment in fear, because that fear is not only economic, but it's also cultural and psychological. And it means that certain people in a given population believe and are taught and are socialized to believe that they should be protected and that they should be protected from other people in particular. And when you have that dichotomy of those who deserve protection and those who are rightfully feared, then we give the justification for a repressive police state. And so the public secret is about knowing that from a particular locatable position in society, that these things are happening, that the police will step on your neck, that the police will kneel on your neck, and that you may not always have a camera phone to capture it, but that these things are ongoing and people have been retelling the particular histories of police violence for as long as they can remember, for generations. And so it's not that people don't know, it's that the people who know feel that they won't be believed. And the fact that they won't be believed is part of the complicity, societal complicity, that people are more wedded to the feeling that they need to be protected than the idea that other people need to be believed. And so in order for this transformation to be possible, it comes from an approach in where we're insisting on a radical form of empathy. And that is what we do as anthropologists. And we can provide, I think, a unique insight into, how to make those connections across spaces and across kind of diverse populations.
Eshe, thank you for prompting that very fruitful, productive conversation. So I see the questions piling up. I don't think we're going to be able to get to them all, but thank you all for those who are asking questions. There's some really important ones in there. So let's see how many we can get to. Danilyn, is your internet stable there?
I'm okay. I've been here all along. I just turned off my video to avoid trouble. If there's trouble, then Chip will take over. Great. We have awesome questions, and I would love us to have enough time to get to them all. I'm afraid we won't, but I'm going to try to sort of cluster them a bit. So please,
let's see if she comes back. Danilyn, you're breaking up a little bit.
Maybe try turning off your video.
All right. Danilyn, you were breaking up and then froze. So why don't I, for the moment, oh,
yeah, I think you better take over. That's great.
Okay. All right. You could message me or email me anything you'd like me to ask.
Yep. Okay.
From here. Let's see. So I'll also try to group a few questions to try to get to as many as possible. There were several questions that ask us to reflect on reforms in other places. So for example, have governments or police departments reform be applicable to this moment? This person asking the question is asking, for example, like with gay activism, or to some other extent, South Africa. Someone else had asked not about police reform or governmental reform, but more around the question of repair. Are there other outlets? Are there other mechanisms that have already been in place that might be models, such as how Europe dealt with the Holocaust in the aftermath of World War II, or Truth and Reconciliation Commissions?
I can say a little bit in terms of understanding reform, and I think both the example of in the US gay activism, and I know less about South Africa, but I'm sure someone in the call, or perhaps someone in the community could speak more to South Africa, is incredibly instructive. And so 1969, Stonewall is a riot started by trans women of color. I think you know this, right? It's a riot against the police and police repression. And now, in most cities, police are part of the Pride Parade. The NYPD actually rolls out rainbow police cars to go with the procession that they drive all around the city with during the month of June. Those are the same police cars they hop out of to beat Black people, right? To shoot them in their bedrooms. They don't check about whether they're queer or not before they bring them to the ground and smush the breath out of their body. And so I think that gay activism is an excellent example of why police reforms and this kind of cannibalization of the ask for safety into the structure of the state is not reconcilable with the demand to keep breath in the Black body. In South Africa, I think, from my limited experience, what we see is the kind of part of what Deb was talking about, the diversity of Blackness being pulled apart, where you have the BEE, the Black economic empowerment class, being separated from poor, abjectly poor Black people, so that it is still Black people who are being killed by the police. It's still Black people's murders who are not being investigated by the police, but they are poor Black people. And so the presence of Black people in Mercedes-Benzes, the presence of Black people with their own security details becomes an alibi against the ongoing death of Black people at the hands of the police, and also the ongoing lack of running water, access to decent education, the stuff of life making for Black people in South Africa is rationalized by the presence of rich, powerful Black people. And so I think that is also really instructive in terms of how we talk about the kind of this thing that's happening with like defund the police really means start over like we did in Camden. I'm from the city of Philadelphia. I know a couple things about Camden and the new Camden Police Department, which is being kind of discussed a little bit in the media as an example of what happens when you defund the police. This is not an example. This is not an example. This is just, it's a reconstitution, and a very expensive one, a reconstitution of the same forms of violence, right? And one of what, for much of my childhood, was the poorest city in the United States, right? It's certainly in the Northeast. And so the ask to defund the police is not an ask for reform. I saw another one of the questions was, after you defund the police, what next? Which I think is a very real question. Here in the Bay Area, London Breed, who was a mayor of the city of San Francisco, with whom we can have a different discussion about London Breed in San Francisco. But her first act in this, towards what happens after you defund the police, is to establish a department of unarmed, basically EMS social workers that will be called to respond to non-violent events. So we'll see how this rolls out in terms of what counts as violent and what doesn't, but literally shifting what we mean by first responders. And I want to share, I don't have the chat function, but a lot of what I'm thinking now is really informed by the work of people on the ground. And so Chip, you asked about, are people doing this work? And I think not only are folks doing the work of, in next Wednesday, the Oakland Unified School District will vote on a proposition to end its contract with the Oakland Police Department, right? And so there's 2 weeks of actions by community members throughout, and it's a multiracial effort to really mobilize folks in the service of Black life. And that first piece is cutting that contract. And we're talking about a place in California where there's more killings of Latinx people in the immediate Bay Area, of non-Black Latinx people, than Black people, right? So it's really important to talk about how are these forms of structural violence that draw on this ongoing Black suffering also being enacted all across the Americas. And so, for instance, there's a school board member, Oakland's very multinational, multi-ethnic, and that's their thing. School board member Gary Yee, Chinese American, and very invested in kind of Asian American politics. There was an all Asian American family protest that took over the block of his house, and Asian American mothers, Asian American fathers and children saying, hey, this is our community, right? We don't feel safer with the police because our classmates don't feel safer with the police. Can you, not despite, but because of your Chinese Americanness, step forward to keep Black children safe in schools? And Gary Yee has shifted his vote from what he said before last school board meeting to what he says he's going to vote next week. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think people are starting to cut in. And the second piece I would say, I don't know how to share this out, but there's a recent piece that was published by a person who I only know by Stevie, who is a currently incarcerated intellectual, and I'll send a blog post out that Stevie wrote, that really talked about the difference between safety and security. right? So you say what happens after the police are gone, then what? There's 300 people on this call. At least 30, if not 60, if not 100 are survivors of sexual violence. That kind of violence is almost never interrupted by the police. And I ask us, whose harm was stopped by the police? Whose body was held whole by the police in the moment when you most needed it? And so I think what Stevie said was, we ask for safety and we get security. And the police didn't make you feel safer in that moment. And so he says, like, let's think about what made you feel safe. What are the moments when you felt safest? Does any of us imagine the police in that moment when we felt safest? And he talks about right relationship really being what creates safety. And so the establishment of community-based real safety, the safety that keeps Toyin Salu's body full of breath and not cut and violated in Atlanta, that keeps Remy Fell's legs attached to her and breath in her body, killed as she was blocks from where I grew up in Philadelphia. These are the kinds of safety that the police have never addressed and that we need to sustain far beyond anything that has to do with police and prisons, but really actually centering the safety and the wholeness and the sanctity of our lives.
Thank you. Let's ask a question here related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The question is, do you agree with the thought that mass social distancing has led to reduced cultural distance via social and transformational communication media? Did you catch that?
I can take a stab at the question.
Okay, great.
I think one thing that COVID did during this time is to just announce or amplify the failure of governance. And so that failure nationally in real time, when you have to be quarantined and you see the limitations of a society that you're told that will protect you. And I think it goes back to what Savannah just said. When you need actually safety, what is the government providing you, right? You can't get masks, you can't get tests, you still have to pay rent, right? And so I think there is a shared vulnerability through COVID that I think disentangled blame from suffering. And I think that everybody experienced that it could not be your fault that you can get COVID and you could just walk down the street and happen to be succumbed by this deadly disease. And it will not be your fault, right? And you are not to blame because of that. But, Black people have always known that it could not be your fault that you could just be walking down the street and be killed by the police. And you are not to blame for that. And it's something that can happen to you. And there's a vulnerability in that. And I think having the juxtaposition between COVID and these police killings in which people are refusing to believe that George Floyd, Breonna Taylor are to blame. And I think for some of the population, that is unprecedented, right? There's an automatic knee-jerk reaction to give the benefit of the doubt to the police and say that, well, there are some dangerous people, or maybe the person was mistaken for a dangerous person, or maybe the person did something that put them at risk. But I think seeing a kind of failure of a governance that puts us all in danger helps to kind of solidify a more kind of diverse form of political protest in this current moment.
Thank you for answering that, Professor Ralph. I thought it might be interesting to read a comment here. So this is more of a comment than a question, but thanks to all the wonderful speakers and organizers for making this available. I'm watching from Mapardwe, Central Australia, where police killings and a history of colonial massacres are a present reality, an enduring cause of suffering for many people. I've heard so many deeply relevant things said about histories of race and state power formations and practices, and I'm looking forward to reading more of all your work. Best regards from Lisa. So I think that comment really knits together a lot of the conversations around how the past is present, as well as these issues of just how global and international, transnational these forms of state violence are. This is a question a little more about your practice as anthropologists. How do you all stay sane in your work? I think implying because it's such hard work. So how do you all stay sane?
Very, very carefully. I think that, you know, this is very, very hard work, but to be very honest with you, for me, actually speaking about these things and speaking my truth and the truths of the folk that I've been working with is a form of healing to me. And so what actually eats me inside is not telling and not talking about the realities of what's going on. And so for me, as painful as writing is, and it is extremely painful. For me to write the introduction to my book, there was a time when I couldn't reread it to edit it because I would weep every time I would reread it to edit it. And this is painful work, but it's also wake work, to quote Christina Sharp. It's also the work that we do to feed our lives and to feed ourselves. And so I think that would be my answer.
Absolutely. And I think Christina was here for a moment, at least earlier. And I think Amen asked that question. To be frank, I don't think it's not the work that keeps me from being sane. It's the being. And so the wake work is the work of surviving and breathing in the body that I've inherited. It's not specific to my practice. So I think my strategies to stay sane would be the same if I was dropping off mail or driving an Amazon truck. And so I think it's important that, for me at least, my work, the method isn't specific to the ways that I stay something like a person.
Yeah, I would just second that and say, on top of what everybody else has said, good friends, good music, good wine.
Well, we don't want to keep you from that, Professor Thomas, but we do have a few more questions that hopefully we can get to before I pass the baton back to Danilyn. So this is a question that comes in that ties somewhat back into COVID, but also goes far beyond it. How do we work towards a future in which Black death is not wholly traumatic, cyclical, and choreographed? The current moment reminds me of how police violence and health disparities among other structures of anti-Black violence across the diaspora work concomitantly to make Black death almost always unnatural and avoidable. Any thoughts on that question? Professor Shange? Or Professor Smith? Yeah.
I was just going to say something really quick and then I'll pass it to Savannah. I want to just remember, going back to wake work, that the wake work that Sharp describes is not only caring for the living, but it is also caring for the dead. And so that would be my answer to that question.
I was just gonna second that. I do think that this piece of like, what does non-traumatic Black life, non-traumatic Black death look like, I think is really key. Miss Major, who is a survivor of the very beginning of what we now understand to be the gay pride movement and like a lifelong Black trans woman leader, is now an elder. And I think one of the reasons people look to her leadership so powerfully is because the figure of the elder Black trans woman has almost come to seem impossible, right? So what we want is for our Black trans sisters not to have an average life expectancy of 35. So the right to die of old age, the right to get, COPD, the right to have great grandchildren and nieces and nephews, to age, to become decrepit, to retire. These aspirations of normalcy, I think, are both so sacred, right? And also it really shed light on how far the gap is between surviving and thriving, right? We're spending so much time thinking about Black survival and keeping breath in the Black body. We don't even get a chance to say what we're going to do and say and sing with that breath.
Yeah, and I think that goes back almost to your earlier question, Chip, about reform, and to sort of reroute that question and to instead ask, what would have to be done for Black life to thrive in different contexts? What structures need to be put in place? What forms of support and care and alliance need to be underway in order to create something rather than to shift something that's already been detrimental? I think that's the way to create a non-traumatic Black death.
Just to add that I think in all of our work, we also hold out space for the possible, the futuristic, as Savannah said, the will be. And I think that creating a space for that, I think, again, as anthropologically, for what people are doing to imagine, is also part of the process. And I think it goes back to the earlier question about what makes this kind of work worth it in terms of how we are being and how we practice anthropology. And I think that I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think at least for me, it is that kind of grappling and engagement with the kind of future that people are trying to create in the moment that always provides a form of nourishment for the work.
Great. Let's try to squeeze in one more question if we could. And because I think this question really links to one of the key themes of this evening's webinar and discussion. So the question is, what is the best way to respectfully integrate understanding anti-Black racism in the domestic context with the international context in a way that does not minimize the US Black experience of my peers and the experience of US-based activists? Is it disrespectful to try to understand a broader picture? As an ally, should I deal with US racism first before trying to understand transnational issues?
I just want to say something to that really quickly. I think that for many of us, Blackness, we work with Blackness diasporically. And for many of the folk that we work with, I know definitely for the folk that I work with in Brazil, they see US Black Americans as kindred. And I say that because, not to make it seem as if everybody gets along all the time, because I'm sure many people on the call do not get along with your family all the time. But to recognize the common genealogies and the common struggles. And so I think that to talk about the transnational dimensions of anti-Black violence is not to be disrespectful in that regard. I do think that we have to be very, very careful to recognize the genealogies of violence. And so you cannot, I mean, I think one of the things that's been unsettling to me in some conversations are the ways that people have been kind of pitting Latin American and Latino conversations against Black conversations, as if there aren't Black folk in Latin America, as if there aren't Black Latinos here who are getting killed by the police. So taking care to really truly understand the spaces that we're talking about, understand the politics, peeling back the layers, and making sure that we are listening is key. And I have found that when you're listening and you come in true solidarity and dedication with folk, then, you know, just last year, this time, or a little bit over a year ago, I sat down with one of the organizers that I have been working with for almost 20 years. And Erica Totten, not Erica Totten, sorry, think about Erica Totten in DC, and Erica Huggins of the Black Panther Party, and moderated a conversation with them. And so I think part of what we need to be careful of is assuming that nationality is the primary way that we understand each other, because that's not the case for many of us.
I'm glad I was muted. You couldn't hear all the sound effects I was just giving during what Christen said. And what you said was the transnational nature of anti-Black state violence, right? The transnational nature of anti-Black state violence. And I bring that up because there's Black people in every nation, right? Wherever it is that you're writing from and thinking from and speaking from, it's Black people there. And so I'm asking that because I think that to come with respect is one piece, but what I hear you calling for, Christen, is actually extending beyond respect to dedication to care, right? And so I think if you're starting with respect, that may not be the place to directly encounter Black life, right? Because respect is maybe not enough to slice through the ongoingness of this kinds of violence, but dedication and care, I think, can allow us to see the transnational nature of anti-Blackness. And Deb and Kamari brought together a collection in 2006, Globalization and Race, that really gives a lot of frameworks to understand how race in general and Blackness in particular are not siloed in the US, right? Even given this kind of oversized footprint of US exceptionalism, which we have to deal with. And so as a model, I'd like to think about, for instance, Black and Palestinian folks who've been working in solidarity. And that's a very intense conversation to think about when folks are saying, hey, you're being killed, this kind of, we can go from this comparative lens, right, of ongoing settler colonialism and brutality with police violence, and this kind of, how do we see one another not in tension, but in collaboration? And there's some very real work being done around deeply addressing anti-Arab sentiment, deeply addressing healing wounds between Black and Arab communities in the US, and talking about the ongoing violence against Black people in occupied Palestine and in the Palestinian territories. And so I think how Black and Palestinian folks are working across that to go into a deeper place that doesn't come from respect, but comes from solidarity, love, and a commitment to extend life is maybe a model for that.
Well, there's so much more to say. Thank you all for engaging with those questions so thoughtfully. And I apologize to the audience that we weren't able to get to them all. We are going to share these questions with all of our panelists, so they'll be able to reflect on them and I'm sure engage into the future with the ways all of you are thinking about all of these quandaries and issues and seeking ways to move forward. So with that, Danilyn, I will pass the baton back and see if we're able to successfully connect with where you are.
Okay, great. I've unmuted. I'm going to leave my video off just for the moment, but I think this is a really good place for us to think about next steps. I really appreciate what was just said about respect and care. So how do we act on care? First of all, educate yourself. Read, study, engage. Buy these books and read them if you haven't already. There's some beautiful and really powerful.
Danilyn?
Apology, because a bunch of the questions, you can't hear me. Yep.
You just came back momentarily. Why don't you try one more time?
Okay, great. How much did you hear?
Just to start.
Okay. Read, study, engage, buy these books and read them if you haven't already. Support Black organizations.
Sorry, Danilyn. I'll interrupt again. I hate to do that because I know how much you were looking forward to wrapping things up for us. And Danilyn, a few notes before the panel tonight. And so I'll just, I think, help wrap up. So a true and heartfelt thank you to all the panelists, everyone attending. And Danilyn, I think, was really hoping to think about next steps, not in terms of words, but in terms of concrete action. And so really encouraging all of us to continue to educate ourselves, to read and study, to engage, to support Black organizations working for police reform and social justice, attend protests, support and protect Black protesters. And then especially for those of us in anthropology, we have a lot of work cut out for us. People of African descent are woefully underrepresented in anthropology. And so we need to take concrete steps to change the fundamental nature of our discipline. And that's going to take more than talk. It's going to take resources. It's going to take real change. Danilyn had noted that even at the Wenner-Gren Foundation itself, that we have work to be done to look at ourselves, to look at current policies and practices and our history, and to look with an eye towards taking concrete steps. And so fundamentally, we need to ensure that our commitments don't just end at words. So again, thank you all so much for your contributions. Really appreciate it. And we hope to see you again very soon. So take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you
Have a
so much.
wonderful evening.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you so much to all of you for
Everyone
coming.
who attended. Okay, great.
And thanks again to Danilyn and Eshe.